Welcome back. Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you joining us throughout the years. We're using two Twitter accounts for where we provide information, news, analysis about what's going on in Mexico, both in English and in Spanish. The Twitter account for this show is @MexicoDaily. And I do a lot of tweeting in English and in Spanish with my personal account, which is @Mexico, @AM Salazar. So hopefully you can follow us in either account. One of the issues that we've been following very closely on this show since we started broadcasting Living in Mexico a long time ago, 2005. Can you believe it? We're almost 20 years. We've been on the air every weekend. One of the issues that we've been following very closely has to do with the issue of poverty. And throughout the years, we bring analysts, or we've invited analysts to kind of explain to us what's the status of the policies, programs, proposals by candidates, implementation of some of these programs, changes to these programs. And it is always very frustrating to feel that things aren't getting better in Mexico, at least from the point of view of poverty policies. Joining us today is an expert. I really appreciate that you took the time to come and talk to us about a book that was just published this week. The book is Dynamics of Poverty in Mexico. It's a book that was sponsored by Centro de Estudios Espinosa Iglesias, CEEY. You know this group. This is a think tank that we've had their analysts join us throughout the years. Well, they just published this book, this report of Dynamics of Poverty in Mexico. And the author, Graciela Teruel, is joining us today. Graciela, thank you so much for joining us. She's the Dean of Social Studies at the Iberoamericana University. And I've been looking forward to talk to you about the study because I wish you could give us good news that things are improving in Mexico. But I think based on the summary of the report, it doesn't seem that it's getting better. Anyway, welcome to the show, Graciela.
Oh, thank you very much, Ana Maria, for inviting me to share the results of this book.
Well, just walk us through. Just tell us the scope of the study, and let's start talking about your conclusions.
Yeah. So let me tell you how it all started. So I was a member of the Academic Council of Coneval. And Coneval is the institution in Mexico that officially measures poverty in this country.
Right.
And so we've been providing results, poverty measurements for a long time, starting in 2008. And basically what we see since 1980 is that poverty rates haven't really changed. They haven't changed at all. It's around 1 out of every 2 Mexicans are in poverty, and these are official measurements. So what Coneval does in order to provide these estimates is that they use data coming from the National Income and Expenditure Surveys, and they're published every 2 years. So basically every 2 years we have data on poverty. And basically, as I said, these poverty measurements haven't changed. So what we started, and I say we because it's not only Universidad Iberoamericana, but also CIDE, we started a project back in 2002 that is called the Mexican Family Life Survey, which is a different kind of survey that actually follows individuals over time. So what we're able to see with official poverty measurements is you see pictures every 2 years, and you see the poverty rates that haven't really changed. So the question that we posed back in 2000 was, is it true that poverty doesn't change? If you're born in a poor household, are you condemned to live in poverty ever since or all your life? And so we started this cohort. So we had like 35,000 individuals interviewed in the survey in the year 2002, and we started following them for 10 years. So we basically have a panel study or a longitudinal survey that follows individuals over time. So what this allows is to look at poverty in a different way. So instead of just calculating these poverty rates every 2 years, we're able to see who goes into poverty, who is able to leave poverty, and we can tackle social mobility in a different way. We can see what happens to transitions in and out of poverty. And so what we find in the study over a period of 10 years is that if you look at the overall results, we have that 7 out of 10 people have been in poverty at least once in these 10 years, 7 out of 10. So that's one first result. The other important result is that if we look at what we call in the book chronic poverty, so those people that have always been in poverty, they have never been out of poverty, is 25% of the population. So 25% of the population over the course of these 10 years have remained in what we called chronic poverty. That's another result. And then I would say that another result is that 1 out of every 2 people have been transitioning in and out of poverty. So there is social mobility, but there's something that always brings you back into poverty. So this is what we call persistent poverty or transit poverty. So these are some of the main results. So when we ask this question about why hasn't poverty moved in Mexico? Why, if you look at measurements of poverty, they're stagnant? So one of the reasons is that we can classify like the population in Mexico, those that have been in and out of poverty or that are consistently in poverty, into different groups. And what we say in the book is that we should target different public policies to different groups instead of doing what the previous governments and the current government is doing, which is just universal programs for everyone. To tackle poverty, they just give like the same kind of program for everyone. So there's some people who need, for example, assistance with respect to food because their income levels are very, very low. But there are others who don't need necessarily food, but they need interventions associated with keeping, for example, their job. No, so the basic, I would say, like the basic message of the book is that if you really want to tackle more effectively poverty, if you want to mitigate poverty in Mexico, we need to have like different public policies targeted at the different groups.
You know, it's the conclusions that you lay out of this report is very disconcerting, I would say, because, you know, in the last, we've been doing this show for almost 18 years. And, you know, it always seemed that there was each president or each administration coming in, they would talk about poverty and that these programs and the investments to provide support and try to bring people out of particularly extreme poverty. See, it was a priority for all these presidents. I mean, I mean, you know, we could fight. Yeah. I think we can debate as to whether there was enough resources injected or, you know, was there corruption. But I mean, I think there was a sense throughout the last 30 years that that poverty in order for Mexico to move forward, extreme poverty had to be resolved. So let me ask you this. It seems that with this government, there was a change in policy in terms of just providing, instead of having these programs that would follow, los acompañaba, I guess would be the word in Spanish, that there were these different programs in which they would provide certain monetary assistance, but mainly a lot of supervision, service, and trying to provide services. as a way of getting people out of extreme poverty. This government, President Manuel Lopez Obrador decided that the priority had to be cash transfers. Now, is that how useful is that types of policies? Because at the end of the day, people will have a certain amount of cash in their pockets that will at least keep them out of extreme poverty. I mean, I'm trying to even, I have a lot of confusion in terms of even what is the policies of this current government. But do you understand my question?
So mainly this government has actually, well, at the end decided that cash transfers is the way to go. And I think it is the way to go for some part of the population. There's a part of the population, those that are in extreme poverty, those that even if they spent all the income they have on trying to satisfy their food needs, they wouldn't be able to do so. So for those that are in extreme poverty, I think it is something good to get some cash transfers in order to get them going. But that's not the policy that should be directed to those that are not in extreme poverty, but that are in poverty. So what the official measurement calls the moderate poverty. Right? So for those, there are different kinds of people. There's some people that have fallen into poverty because they lost their job, but they don't necessarily have any problem with complying with the social rights. So for example, access to education or access to health, social security. So those social rights could be okay in terms of their measurement, but they lack the support on, for example, income. So if you just give them the monetary transfer that has to do with, for example, food transfer, that's not going to do nothing. That's going to do nothing. That's not going to be enough. That's not what they need. So so for example, this government has apostado, has bet on, obviously has bet on the cash transfers, but there's so much more that is needed. So look at what happened, for example, during the COVID crisis, right? You had a lot of people, obviously, those in the informal sector suffering from employment, but what happened to access to health, right? There's no access to health. So there are other dimensions in which certain kinds of subpopulations in Mexico need different kinds of interventions. So that's like the main point that I want to make. I mean, I think it's very popular to give cash transfers. Who's gonna oppose receiving any kind of money? But that's not the way in order to start solving the problem.
Because I remember some of the prior administrations, they would have some cash transfers, but in order to receive the cash, you had to prove that your children were actually going to school.
Oportunidades program, right?
Yeah, they would provide certain meals, or, I mean, there seemed to be, and there seemed to be services and resources provided in addition to some supervision from the government, either the federal government or the state government, and in these programs. And of course, these programs were considered, at least the opposition at the time would always accuse that there was the use of these programs were more for political objectives. So of course, that debate is still right now. For political reasons, it's much better to provide cash transfers, and perhaps it's cheaper and for the federal government. So let me ask you this: what would be these services that could make, or those needs that could make, if they were satisfied, would have an enormous impact in the next couple of years in changing the dynamics of poverty in Mexico?
Yeah. Well, let me just comment on what you previously said before I answer your question. So there's always this tension, especially now, whether programs should be targeted or not. So today they're universal. So everyone gets access to, for example, the old adults pension, right? It doesn't matter if you don't need it. Doesn't matter if you live in a zip code that is rich. Everyone who wants and who asks for the transfer, for the pension, gets it. So these are like completely unconditional and universal transfers. The ones that you were talking about were the conditional transfers, and they were conditional because people or children or households were asked to do something in return for getting the transfer. But the most important social policy, in my view, with respect to the previous governments, has to do with targeting. So selecting who gets the benefit. So not everyone, not universal transfers, not everyone gets the transfer, but those that actually need it. So there was this sense that resources were not enough for everyone. So they should be targeted or directed to those who are mostly in need. So there was this idea of having to collect data or use already collected data that already existed in order to select those who would really benefit most from the transfers. So having said that, I believe more in targeted programs relative to universal transfers, because I believe we don't have enough resources just to give everyone everything, right? So in that sense, I prefer that kind of social policy. But having said that, I think that if you really wanted to improve poverty rates in Mexico, I would start first with the extreme poor, which are those that need, in terms of the official poverty measurements, those that have deprivation of social rights, at least 3 or more, and those that don't even have the enough income to fulfill all their food needs. So those are the extreme poor. Around there, we have a little bit less than 10% of the population in that subgroup. So those need a lot of things. They don't only need cash transfer in order to
satisfy their basic needs, right? Yeah.
To satisfy their basic needs, but they need education for their kids. Right. They probably need support for their transport. They also need, obviously, health services. If you look at a map of where the hospitals are located and the clinics are located in Mexico, there are deserts of service. Deserts. There are places where there's nothing. So if you live in a very rural, isolated community in Mexico and you have an emergency, the likelihood that you die is very high. Right? So there are a lot of things that these kinds of people in extreme poverty need. Right? And then you can start to look at what happens to the vulnerable poor or to the vulnerable by income and to the rest of the population, and they need different kinds of policies. So I would start, first of all, with the poorest of the poor.
It's so good to talk to you, because sometimes it's hard to talk about these issues. I'm looking forward to reading in detail what this report has to say. The name of the report is Dynamics of Poverty in Mexico. One of the persons that participate in this report is Graciela Teruel. I really appreciate you joining us. She's the Dean of Social Studies at Iberoamericana University. And promise me you'll come back, because I would like to expand on these issues, because as you know, we're in the middle of presidential elections, and the issue of poverty clearly has to be one of the issues that has to be discussed and analyzed by anybody who wants to become the next president of Mexico or the next senator or the next mayor. I mean, because it is one of the big factors of life here in Mexico. So I really appreciate you joining us, Graciela. Thank you so much.
Ana Maria, thank you very much for the invitation. I'll come back whenever you invite me.
Oh, I really appreciate that, Graciela Teruel. We're going to go to commercial break, and please don't go away. I'm Ana Maria Salazar, and we'll be right back.